PEDs, HGH, steroids. They aren't just being used by professional athletes and bodybuilders, but by high schoolers that want to improve their athletic performance, office workers who want to improve their physiques and self-confidence, and maybe by your parents or grandparents that just want to regain their virility. The risks of many of these drugs are unknown, while their acquisition is often by less than legitimate means. So should people be able to put them into their body for reasons related to their pursuit of their own happiness? Or is the risk too high to allow individuals to make this decision? I talk to our experts when we discuss the impact of steroid use on this episode of Debating Health.
Doctor, please, don't you know I'm going fast?
Welcome to Debating Health. I'm your host, Scott Ehrlich. Our topic for today is steroids. They've been a very controversial issue for decades. In the 1970s, they were tied to bodybuilding, notably discussed in Arnold Schwarzenegger's documentary Pumping Iron. In the 80s, football, with Lyle Alzado and Brian Bosworth, among others. Later in the century, they made their way in the public consciousness through baseball, from the Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa home run derby to Barry Bonds in the early 2000s. Now, steroids aren't just for professional athletes anymore. Commercials push testosterone to men with low T. Young men take them to feel better about their beach bodies and have more confidence with the ladies. Older men who lost their virility take them. Steroids have gone from being solely about enhanced athletic performance to a way of improving self-image. What does this mean for society, with everything from cosmetic surgery to Botox to cool sculpting now commonplace? Should steroids be treated differently? Should people who want to feel better about themselves be limited in what they take if they're informed about the risks and potential side effects? What if they have a doctor guiding them through the process to mitigate risk? Or are steroids a unique risk? Behavior changes, increased aggression, hormonal shifts have all been linked to their use. Many of the steroids taken today are obtained illegally, made in less than optimal conditions and who knows where. They are taken by uneducated populace without medical supervision and can lead to lifelong side effects, if not shorten lives entirely if used improperly. So should steroids be easier to obtain? Or are they so dangerous that society can't take that risk? Our guest today, Mike Riggs of Reason Magazine and Don Hooton of the Hooton Foudation, will give their perspectives on this edition of Debating Health.
Hit me with your best shot. Come on, hit me with your best shot.
Our first guest is a strong believer that people should be able to put into their bodies what they choose, as long as they're consenting adults and are making an informed decision. I'm here with Mike Riggs, a senior reporter at Reason. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Mike, I know we want to talk about steroid usage, and you've taken the topic or the position that steroids should be made more accessible, that legislation should be changed to allow them to be utilized by more people. Let me ask you, do you have any personal experiences with steroids that you could share?
So I tried steroids briefly in my mid-20s. I used some oral steroids for about a month, and to be clear, oral anabolic steroids, not corticosteroids, which I have taken in treatment for ulcerative colitis, but it's a totally different animal. But yeah, so I did try anabolic steroids for about a month, and I'm pretty sure that I did it in just about the dumbest way possible. And I have not tried them since then, because even though I did a lot of research for the piece I wrote for Reason and know a lot of people use anabolic steroids, for me, the cost-benefit analysis, it just doesn't make sense at this point in my life.
Completely understand, but did you have any of the negative effects that are frequently cited as a reason to keep steroids illegal?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I know that sounds like a wishy-washy answer. Like, when in the process of reporting the story, I wrote about testosterone replacement therapy, which is kind of a vector for people who want performance-enhancing drugs to get them legally. And one of the things you have to do if you want to get them from a doctor is have your hormone levels checked. So, out of curiosity, I did order a hormone panel, a male hormone panel. And everything is fine. I have a perfectly healthy, normal testosterone level for a man my age. My other hormones like luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, everything was normal. Cholesterol was good. Blood pressure was good. I don't know at the time. Again, I said that I used them in my mid-20s and probably the dumbest way possible. I have no idea what a hormone panel would have showed over the course of that month or in the months or weeks afterward. I did not lose my hair. I did not develop any acne. I did not develop gynecomastia. I don't think I had high blood pressure or any liver damage at the time. But I also, again, was doing it very stupidly, so I have no idea.
Do you find that that's one of the major reasons for making them more accessible, is that people like you that maybe when you were 20s that would have been using them would be using it under more doctor's care and medical care than trying to, I guess, keep that hidden because of both the stigma and illegality about them?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that any behavior that is the worst consequence of which is self-harm should be brought into the light so that medical experts can provide people with information that, while the internet has gotten better at providing it, still doesn't tell you exactly how it's going to affect you personally. So I know that, again, while I was researching this story for a reason, I saw a lot of conversations between very young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, asking older steroid users, like, is now a good time to go on? And a lot of steroid users, older guys in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and up, would say, no, you should not do this right now. And some of these younger guys would do it anyway. Was that
solely with anabolic steroids, or was that also was that just testosterone replacement therapy?
That was with anabolic steroids. I think it's I mean, my understanding is that it's very difficult for an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old to get testosterone replacement therapy.
Sure, especially at that point, if there's no demonstrable benefits other than potentially aesthetic benefits. I mean, I assume if you're testicular cancer, it'd be a different story, but we're not really talking about that issue. But delving into that, what's the argument for allowing people to use that? I know you said really the downside, in your opinion, is just self-harm. What is the positive that you would put allowing people to use it for simply that aesthetic purposes? Do you think they should be allowed to use it for improving competitive results just simply because they can? Should there be a distinction between the why?
I mean, I think there has to be. I think you have to, like, if you want to change course on any type of drug policy, you do have to make an argument for why. The least compelling argument to me is for athletic performance, because I think that it should be up to sporting bodies, all of which are, essentially private. I mean, the NFL is private, the MLB, the NBA is private. That should be something that is worked out in contract negotiations with players' unions and team owners. So I wouldn't say that we're missing out on some really good sports because we don't allow performance-enhancing drugs, and so we should. I don't think that's a good enough argument.
Yeah, I don't know. 1998 was pretty fun with the home run derby, but back in McGuire-Sosa days, but yeah.
I remember front-page newspapers back home charting the Sammy Sosa, Mark McGuire home run race. It was fun to look at. But no, I think the better argument is that if used responsibly, it is a net positive. Cohort studies from Canada looking at over 200,000 testosterone replacement users have found that their lipid profiles improved. They had better HDL, lower LDL. They had lower blood pressure. They had more lean muscle mass, less adipose tissue, and stronger bones. So I think that there's a very sound case from like a health perspective to say that there is a way to do this safely, and it does improve quality of life for men. And I also don't object to making them available for aesthetic purposes. We have plastic surgery. The FDA has approved pharmaceutical weight loss drugs. Many doctors now prescribe stimulants like Adderall.
What would a change in the steroid regimen or steroid legalization regimen look like to you? How would you like to see them regulated? Closer to cigarettes, closer to prescription drugs, closer to just OTCs or people self-medicating? What would the ideal regulatory regimen look like to you?
That is a great question because, again, right now in Schedule 3, they are available by prescription. I think the worst thing that can happen to a doctor is that the Drug Enforcement Administration could review their prescribing records, which all scheduled drugs that doctors prescribe, their records then are made available to the DEA. And the DEA could say, we think the dosages you're giving are too high. I'm not sure that happens very often. What I would be
again, in that aspect, you're just talking about testosterone. Or you talk. I mean, could I go to a doctor and get Dianabol or Anadrol or Winstrol or any of those?
Oh, right, all these orals. Yeah, I mean, most doctors do not give you these things. Some of them will give out other types of testosterone, other testosterone derivatives for things like joint pain. But for the most part, you can't get any of these other drugs. And for reasons such as we know now that injectable testosterone gives you all the benefits of all those other drugs with none of the side effects. And, I feel like people kind of like their hair stands on end when you say people should just be able to get these without the threat of prison. That might mean that they incur some self-harm. And I think that's better than incurring harm at the hands of the criminal justice system. So maybe the compromise is something like what we have with pseudoephedrine, with products like Sudafed and Bronchade, where you want to buy this over the counter, fine, but you do have to talk to a pharmacist. You do have to be above a certain age. You do have to provide your driver's license as evidence that you are not reselling these things to minors. We definitely should take policy steps and regulatory steps to keep them out of the hands of teenagers.
Interesting. So in your opinion, what negative arguments against relaxing the legalization of steroids do you find to be valid, and what do you find to be just kind of empty hype or demonization?
I think that probably the most valid one is that and this is honestly one that actually doesn't get made very much, but it's one that occurred to me as I was doing this research, is that the pituitary system and the endocrine system at large is incredibly susceptible to exogenous hormones. If you are using human growth hormone, that is changing the way the rest of your endocrine glands work. It's changing your sensitivity to insulin. If you're taking exogenous insulin, it's also changing the way your pancreas works. If you're taking steroids, it's changing the way your pituitary works and your hypothalamus and your testicles. So basically, it can, if used irresponsibly, it can have a profound effect on the human body, and maybe one that can't necessarily be recovered from, which then means that you are dependent on some pretty expensive health care for the rest of your life. So whenever I think about, what would it mean for expand access to performance-enhancing drugs, I don't find the case for roid rage very compelling. We have millions of men now legally using testosterone. We have not seen rates of domestic violence in that population increase as a response, or rates of manslaughter or homicide or any of this stuff. So instead, when I look at it, I think what would it mean if we made anabolic steroids, all of them, legal tomorrow, made them easy to get? Does that mean 5 or 10 years down the road that we suddenly have millions more men requiring millions of dollars more in healthcare, which, as we know, is a diffused cost product?
Sure.
So that's one of the things I think about, right? Is if I decide, it's my body, I'm going to take these drugs, I'm going to do what I want, I'm going to take more than my doctor recommended because I can, because it's legal now. And then 5 years from now, I am just, my endocrine system is an absolute wreck, and I'm going to need, and I've basically developed a chronic condition as a result of my recreational drug use. And I'm essentially going to be asking everybody in my risk pool, whether that's at my job or on a healthcare exchange, to foot the bill for my self-experimentation for the rest of my life.
Sure. Of course that's true. Yeah, of course that's true, I guess, of smoking, drinking.
It's true for eating poorly.
Yeah, I've given myself, I've probably given myself diabetes from eating poorly, and I'm going to be putting the same thing, and I don't need any doctor's recommendation to do that.
Men who want to use these drugs and cannot get them from a doctor run the risk of being incarcerated for enhancing the way they look and feel. And they also run a health risk that exceeds whatever risk comes from pharmaceutical-grade steroids, and that if you're ordering something that came from Thailand or China or India or an underground lab here in the United States where many steroids are made, men will buy raw powder from some other country and then make them here. That's another health risk. You can develop, infections, you become septic, all kinds of terrible things can happen.
So ideally, in the next 5 to 10 years, let's say, what would you like to see happen on the front of steroids, testosterone, etc.?
I almost feel like there's not a lot that has to happen. Like it's kind of the ball is rolling downhill. My piece looked a lot at the expansion of testosterone replacement therapy. That has essentially exploded. I mean, it was not an industry in the 90s. If you look at 1998, 1999, legal testosterone sales in the United States topped out at about $100 million a year. If you look at by 2020, it's projected to be about $3 billion a year. So this ball is kind of rolling on its own. I think maybe places where in the U.S. where you'd want to see some policy changes would be decriminalization. You know, do not arrest people for ordering these drugs. In terms of the social and cultural changes, physicians tend to get really frustrated when they have patients who use these drugs, and I think I've read a lot of stories about withholding of care, in the sense that a physician will say, well, you decided to use this on your own, you've developed a problem as a result of it, I'm going to do the bare minimum to keep you alive, but, you know, this isn't my fault. And we kind of have a similar issue with the opioid crisis, in that there's just a lot of frustration on the part of care providers with the things that their patients do themselves, and then sort of a reluctance to give them the best available care. So I think in general, maybe a cultural change in the field of medicine that said, you know, you don't have to abet a patient in their pursuit of pharmacological performance enhancement to still give them really good care. You know, if a patient comes to you and says, I have been using anabolic steroids for 5 years, will you please order me a blood panel so that I know that I'm okay, or that I know that I'm not okay and what I need to do next? Doctors should say yes. They should say, you know what? Yes, I will.
In the next 5 to 10 years, where do you see this debate being? Do you think it's going to be status quo? Do you think people are going to move more against steroids? Or do you think that's going to be more of an argument as, like you said, testosterone replacement therapy has exploded? Do you think that will kind of be a canary in a coal mine for what may increase in these areas of these performance-enhancing sort of drugs?
I think within 10 years, for sure, we will have a much clearer view of both what the health effects have been, because again, if you're looking at people who start using testosterone replacement therapy at some point in the early to mid 2000s, you know, by 2027, we'll have had people who've been on it for a decade and a half, 2 decades. So we'll have a lot more cohort data, like retrospective data. It's not the same thing as having a clinical trial that's double-blinded, intended to assess efficacy. But the cohort data is helpful and interesting. And we'll also have, I think, a better sense culturally, you know, once there are enough men, and there could be 10 years from now, there could be hundreds of thousands of men or even millions maybe, who are not hardcore bodybuilders, who are not athletes, who have been taking very moderate doses of testosterone weekly for a decade and a half, 2 decades. And we'll be able to get a sense not just of their health, but of also, like, is this worth it? You have been doing this for a long time now, and because you've been doing it for so long, you are now going to have to do it until you die. Is it worth it? I suspect that within 10 years, a change in the medical profession will be that testosterone therapy will be more like plastic surgery, and that doctors feel even less obligated. Doctors who are more liberal prescribers of testosterone will feel perhaps even less obligated 10 years from now to obscure what they're doing. Again, there are many TRT providers who are taking men from the low range into the middle of the range because the risks of having low testosterone are real. But again, we've got this another population of doctors that is taking people from the middle range up to the high end of the range and making that same medical argument that we're just making people healthier. Yeah, you want to be more muscular. You want to be able to run faster. You want to feel like at 45 like you felt at 20. This is safe. You're the customer. I'm the provider. Let's do this. So I think in 10 years, that's what we'll see.
And you'd be comfortable with that sort of system?
Yeah, I definitely, again, and I have no problem with doctors leading the way on this or acting as a stopgap, as long as you had doctors who kind of acknowledge that, like, yes, part of your role is to fix people, but you're also, like, you're service providers. Like, your business is helping people be their best selves. And if you want to be the kind of person who helps people be their best selves because you want to take people from illness into health, fine. But there should be healthy people who want to optimize their health, healthy people who want to be the healthiest they can be, strong people who want to be stronger, fast people who want to be faster. So long as there are safe options for that, they should not feel ashamed to talk to people whose specialty is the human body about doing that kind of thing.
Mike, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Very interesting stuff.
Separated.
And now let's look at the counterpoint, as our second guest is someone who had a horrible family experience with steroids and has made it his mission to educate people on the harms that come from taking them. I'm here with Don Hooton, the founder and executive chairman of the Taylor Hooton Foundation. Don, thanks for joining us here.
Glad to be here with you.
Don, I want to talk to you about steroids, which I know is a very important issue to you and your foundation. Do you know anyone that personally has used steroids, and can you describe any effects that you noticed that they may have described from the usage as positive or negative?
Sure. The individual that I know and am the closest to that used anabolic steroids was my son Taylor. Was a high school student, a baseball player, and at 16 years old began using two different forms of anabolic steroids, an injectable as well as an oral tablet form. Taylor began to show or exhibit all of the classical physical signs of anabolic steroid use. He put on about 30 pounds of muscle in 90 days. He developed a severe case of acne across his back, had bad breath, showed a puffiness in his face and neck and wrists and ankles. That and I've probably sit here and think of some more, all of the classical textbook physical signs of anabolic steroid use. Taylor was showing them all, but what we noticed most, Scott, were the emotional changes that Taylor was exhibiting. These anabolic steroids are various forms of testosterone in any normal growing adolescent. The testosterone will cause wide mood swings. Well, excess testosterone injected with it accelerates those mood swings, and we saw both the aggression in the form of roid rage. On multiple occasions, Taylor would drive his fist into a sheetrock wall or into the floor. Almost broke his hand one time. We had to take him to an orthopedic surgeon. But the worst was the opposite side of the mood swing is depression. And the doctors tell us Harvard study shows that 29% of users coming off of steroids will exhibit severe depression. And I emphasize the word severe. And Taylor's was bad enough that he wound up committing suicide. So that's my testimonial to what we've seen firsthand, side effects that could go along with anabolic steroids.
Now, Don, as a father myself, my condolences to you. I couldn't imagine something like that happening with my son. But to stick with the issue here at hand, I was a grumpy teenager. I would stick my hand through walls from computer baseball. I went through severe bouts of depression. I've been on antidepressants for a number of years. And I did this all without using steroids. And it all happened around the same time period. How can you be sure that what happened with him would be linked specifically to steroid use and not just normal problems that a 16-year-old boy may experience?
Well, we raised two other children that were older than Taylor, an older brother and an older sister. So, Scott, we've seen those mood swings before. You know, grumpy 1 minute and exuberant the next. So, we had firsthand experience in raising kids through the teenage years. So number one, we could personally testify that these were excessive. They were a lot worse than what would have seen normally. Number two, we've had a number of the world's first-class doctors, endocrinologists, psychiatrists, have reviewed Taylor's case and confirmed that what we were seeing and all of the symptoms that we've described to them it is very, very highly likely. I guess you can never actually prove that X equals Y here, but that it's more than highly likely that what we were seeing was the result of anabolic steroids.
Do you know where he acquired them and why he used them? Was it simply for athletic reasons?
Yeah, what Taylor told his psychiatrist, we had him treated because of some of the mood swings he was showing. He explained to the psychiatrist that the reason he started was in reaction to his baseball coach telling he and one of his buddies that they needed to get bigger to improve their chances of making the varsity team in baseball. Now, not blaming the coach. This isn't about blaming the coach for it, but that's how he explained it to the psychiatrist. And as we tell the coaches, you got to give up on telling kids they need to get bigger unless you're trained to show them how to get bigger. So that's where it started, but also hindsight, it shifted along the way to one of, for aesthetic reasons, wanting to look better. He was enjoying his new physique, and as one of his buddies says, he moved into a whole new class of girls, and that kind of reinforced the benefits that went along with using these drugs.
So what was the depression related to? Was that from coming off a cycle, or was that just from side effects while he was still on steroids, or you're not sure?
No, we're pretty sure it was while he was coming off of the steroids. The psychiatrist, once she had gotten Taylor to admit that he had been using anabolic steroids, her instructions to him were to quit cold turkey. Now, in hindsight, which is always 20/20, that was probably his death sentence. And again, I'm not blaming the psychiatrist. That's not what this is about. But what's missing, she, like all of the doctors around the country, are not trained to treat these users coming off of steroids. There is no medical textbook. There are no medical protocols to treat users of anabolic steroids, which leaves a user, especially a kid, at real risk as they begin to come off of these drugs.
Now, you mentioned Taylor was in high school when he was doing this, and obviously your body's going through a lot of physical changes at that time. I think most ardent defenders, even of steroids, would think that 16-year-olds should not be using steroids. If Taylor was, say, 24 and was playing, let's say, minor league baseball and were to be taking steroids, would you put the same responsibility on the drugs themselves, or would you think that that was a decision that was for him to make?
Well, I don't think it's a decision they should make. The first thing that gets lost in the discussion is these are illegal drugs. It is a felony in almost all jurisdictions in the U.S. to possess these drugs without a legitimate prescription. And a legitimate prescription does not include getting bigger or faster or stronger to make a baseball team.
If I was to go to a doctor and a doctor said I had low testosterone and put me on a low T drugs, I'm in my 30s right now, how would you feel about that?
The low T drugs, in many instances, are just a way to get around some of the laws. There are a number of doctors that believe a lot of these low T clinics are operating illegally, but let's not go down that rat hole. Let's begin by saying that a normal, legitimate prescription for anabolic steroids would provide an adult male like yourself or me steroids that would be taken on the order of 5 to 10 milligrams a day. Just to put it in perspective as to what's the quantity that would be used. Some of these bodybuilders, Scott, I've talked to doctors that are treating some of these bodybuilders that are taking upwards of 3,000 milligrams a week. And the point that gets made here is that these drugs work, but it takes significant quantities of these drugs to get the kind of effects that most young men are looking for, and those quantities are not available with a legitimate prescription for a medical doctor.
When I did some research for this episode, I was looking at different bodybuilding websites and stuff, and I know you do see a lot of people talking to people that say once you kind of hit a certain point with steroids, you're really getting very little of the benefit and almost all the side effect results. So I do think in that community too, there is some self-policing that would see. I mean, I know you mentioned dose amounts. I'm pretty sure they're different depending on the actual steroids you take, but I do think there is some element of people, even steroid users and practitioners that are behind this, saying that you got to be very careful in this, and that there are certainly, it's not a proportional thing where the more you take, the better you get. There certainly is a very low cutoff where you lose the benefits and the side effects.
Scott, if I could interrupt you there to
Sure.
point out, understand what you're reading there. This is all anecdotal stuff coming from bodybuilders in a gym. There's no medical doctors to go to, no medical textbook that you can use as guidance here. You're just going on how did your friend working out with the free weights next to you, what was his experience?
I can go to the doctor. I can get a prescription for Botox because I don't like my wrinkles. I can get a prescription for Latisse because I don't like my eyelashes. I can get a prescription for some weight loss drugs. Why shouldn't I say I'm 35, I'm not as muscular as I'd like to be? I could go to a doctor and he could prescribe me and monitor me, check my vitals, help me cycle on and off to avoid some of these harmful side effects. Why shouldn't I be allowed to do that?
Well, two reasons. One, and it's fairly fundamental, it's illegal for you to do that. The laws would need to be changed. And some of these guys that are advocates, if you're such strong advocates, come out of the shadows and get yourself a movement together and go to the Congress and get the laws changed to make it legal to use it in that way. So assuming it was legal, that's a giant assumption, there's a whole list of dangers you need to be educated about before you start this stuff, not the least of which is the proven damage that this stuff is doing to the entirety of your cardiovascular system when you're taking these drugs. These are not coming from pharmaceutical companies. They're almost 100% of the garbage that's being sold on the street comes from China. It's mixed in uncontrolled I don't even use the word pharmacies.
Sure.
If I showed you pictures of where this stuff is being made, that would probably be enough to cause you to think about 4 or 5 times before you ever considered using it.
Let's say it got through Congress. Let's say those people started a movement allowing personal choice in this field. You could control it. You could, obviously the side effects are always going to be an issue, but having worked in with the drug industry for over a decade now, side effects, dose response is an issue in just about anything you put into your body. You take statins, it's going to mess with your liver. You take antidepressants, you have sexual side effects. Just about anything you take is going to have some kind of side effects. And like you said before, something that may affect one person one way could be disastrous. It could be great for the person sitting next to them. What would be the argument even then for allowing someone to control? Like, let's look at stuff like androgel and the other stuff that is legal right now, that I could go to an endocrinologist and probably find someone that could say, yeah, your T is low enough where I could prescribe it to you. Again, this is something that had to go through the FDA approval process, go through side effects and stuff. Is that a philosophical argument for saying that I should not be allowed to make that decision, or are you really opposed to saying that the risk-benefit ratio is just too harsh to really leave it to the individual consumer to decide?
Well, it's not up to the individual consumer to decide. It's up to his physician. Now, assuming your physician believes you've got a legitimate need for this stuff, or you can talk him into writing you a prescription to this stuff, I guess it's Katie bar the door. You're an adult, and you can do what you want. I would question your judgment if you're taking these kind of risks just to look better. And of course, 80% of the users of these drugs today are not in athletics at all. They are using these drugs for aesthetic reasons, whether it be, and I'm putting bodybuilding competition in that, all the way to just the guy walking the hallways in high school that are using these drugs so that they can get buff and compete for the attention of the ladies, or the girls, and vice versa, trying to compete for the attention of the guys.
So the Taylor Hooton Foundation, what would you like to see happen with steroid laws, with steroids in America? What's your goal here?
Well, our goal, I don't think it's, we're not advocating any changes of laws. What we believe needs to be done is 2 things. One, to raise awareness among the general public about how prolific this problem is. Current estimates are over 4 million or about 4 million users. At the high school level, 7% of our high school students admit using these drugs. It's extraordinarily prolific, number one. Number two, to educate these kids, and we focus on youth in particular. We don't focus on professional athletes. It's too late for those guys. They can make their own decisions. But with the youth, they need to be educated.
What effect do you think professional athletes being caught for these drugs have on kids? Do you think that's a positive effect in a sense that it deters them to see these athletes be outed, in some cases like some of the Baseball Hall of Famers be shunned, to reduce their reliance on that? Or do you think just the fact that they see all these professional athletes taking them and succeeding, sometimes spectacularly by taking them, is an inducement to them to utilize that?
I think you get a mix of both, but I think the more powerful message is on the second point that you made, which is this is just another reinforcement that these drugs work. I mean, you look at, without naming athletes in particular, we could go through a whole list of them. Okay, in football, they had to sit out for 4 games, or in baseball, they had to sit out for an extended period of time, but in the end, they don't lose their 12 or 20 or $50 million contract. So how bad are the penalties really? And that sends a strong message to the kids. Their role models are doing it, not as much as they used to, and baseball hasn't eliminated the problem, but they're getting damn close to it. But every time somebody gets caught, just look how many young men have been caught here in the recent months in football, the NFL. Well, somebody's still using this stuff, and somebody's still cheating and using these drugs to get ahead, and the kids, that's the education they're getting, and it's not a good one.
So what else do you think we can do to help stem this, what you see as an issue? Do you think bringing some of it again out of the shadows in there and making just education more prevalent? Because again, like we've talked about, I mean, there's always going to be demand for people to want to look better, to improve performance, to do that. How is there a way we can acknowledge that issue that's always going to be there? That's something that you're never going to be able to stop, but do so in a way that kids aren't getting harmed, doing irreversible damage to their bodies when they're not able to make that decision, an educated decision on that, while also taking into account that the desire to improve and desire is always going to be there.
Well, we're working in that area in 2 levels. One, education. We travel the country talking to young people. Of course, an organization like us can only scratch the surface at that. But education is a key component. The second thing that we've cranked up is working with the medical community. We're trying to change the fact that medical protocols don't exist. Doctors aren't trained. I mean, we took Taylor to 4 medical doctors to try to figure out what was wrong with him, and he went through the first 3 without them even recognizing or identifying the fact that he was using anabolic steroids. And if the doctors that are treating our young people aren't educated and don't have a textbook to show them, how to treat these kids, we are just basically on the battlefield with no weapons.
Last question for you. Like I said before, I have a son. He's 3. He starts T-ball this weekend. I'm going to be coaching his team. I'm in Georgia right now, like Texas. Great amateurs, athletes, very competitive. 12 years from now, 13 years from now, he's on his high school baseball team. He knows kids from this school go to the draft. They get, like you said, multi-million-dollar contracts. I'm not a great athlete, so he's probably not going to be a great athlete either. He's in the same situation, saying, if I take these pills once in a while, I can add that extra 5-10 miles an hour to my fastball. I could hit a few more home runs, make myself attractive, set myself up for life. What should I say to him to dissuade him from doing that?
Well, educate yourself first. It sounds like you're already a long way down that road, and talk to him. The most important thing is talking at dinner about this stuff in an open and frank way. I think a lot of us adults, the conversation is around the table is about so and so that just didn't get voted into the Hall of Fame or is eligible for the Hall of Fame. Should the sports writers be voting on this guy or not? And I would say, guys, that's not the right discussion to be having with your kids. These, with some of them, we ought to be talking about how many years in jail they should be spending.
Don, thank you so much for joining us again. My condolences on your loss, and best to you.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed visiting with you.
So now I ask you, the listener, how do you feel about steroids? Are there any personal experiences you can share? Maybe incidences where you've taken steroids, family members, friends? How did they feel about it? Did it make them confident and feel better like it did our first guest? Or did the effects harm them, much like our second guest expressed? Should consenting adults be allowed to take them for any reason they wish, whether that's aesthetic or health or athletic performance? Or should we crack down on people prescribing them for less than urgent medical reasons? And what did you think of our guest points on why steroids should and should not be made more prevalent and easier to acquire? Tweet to @DebatingHealth, post on our Facebook page, which is Debating Health, or go to www.debatinghealth.com. And you can also email me directly at scott@ehrlichhealth.com. That's scott@ehrlichhealth.com. We'll be discussing your anecdotes and responses on our next show, as well as debating another controversial aspect of healthcare with our experts on the next episode of Debating Health. Until then, I encourage you to remember that healthcare is complicated, and no one can do more about your own healthcare than you, so take control of your healthcare by making sure to educate yourself. Thank you.
Doctor, please.